Move to economy or get off my plane. The words cracked through the first-class cabin so sharply that conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. A businessman near the window lowered his newspaper. A mother traveling with her teenage son looked up from her phone. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the entire aircraft had inhaled at once and forgotten how to breathe. Flight attendant Nicole Harris stood in the aisle with her arms folded, her expression firm and unyielding. Directly in front of her sat Naomi Brooks, a black woman in her early 40s wearing dark jeans, white sneakers, and a simple black sweater. Nothing about her appearance matched the image many people expected when they imagined someone sitting in seat 2A. That assumption was exactly what had brought the cabin to this moment. Naomi looked up calmly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She didn't reach for her ticket again. She simply met Nicole's eyes and said one word. No. The response landed harder than a shout. Nicole blinked as if she hadn't expected resistance. Around them, passengers exchanged uncertain glances. The plane had already been delayed nearly 15 minutes, and impatience hung in the air like static before a thunderstorm. Nicole straightened her uniform jacket. Ma'am, I've explained this already. That seat is reserved for first-class passengers. Naomi's expression never changed. It is a first-class seat. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Others watched with open curiosity. The tension spreading through the cabin no longer felt like a routine disagreement. It felt like something larger, something everyone recognized, but few wanted to name. Nicole held out her hand. Boarding pass. Naomi handed it over without a word. Nicole glanced at it for less than a second before shaking her head. This doesn't look right. The businessman across the aisle frowned. The barcode was visible. The seat number was visible. Everything appeared normal. Yet Nicole spoke with complete confidence, as though certainty itself could replace evidence. Naomi folded her hands in her lap. The calmness in her posture seemed almost impossible. Most people would have protested by now. Most people would have demanded a supervisor. Naomi simply waited. That patience unsettled Nicole more than any argument could have. A man seated several rows back laughed quietly. Looks like somebody wandered into the wrong cabin. A few nervous chuckles followed. Naomi didn't even turn her head. Outside the window, baggage carts rolled across the tarmac beneath the late afternoon sun. Inside, the atmosphere continued tightening. Nicole stepped closer. This flight is ready for departure. You're delaying everyone. Naomi glanced briefly toward the cockpit door before returning her gaze to Nicole. Am I? The question lingered. Nicole's jaw tightened. Something about the woman's confidence felt wrong. Not arrogance. Not defiance. Certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from knowing something everyone else does not. Several passengers sensed it too. The whispers started growing louder. Why wasn't she worried? Why wasn't she explaining herself? Why did she seem more patient than anyone else on the aircraft? Nicole pointed toward the rear of the plane. Last chance. Economy is available. Naomi looked out across the silent cabin and then back at Nicole. Her voice remained steady, almost gentle. I think we're waiting for someone. And without realizing it, Nicole had just taken the first step toward the mistake that would change the entire flight. The silence that followed her answer seemed to spread through the cabin row by row. Nicole Harris stared at Naomi Brooks as though waiting for the woman to suddenly apologize, gather her belongings, and disappear toward the back of the aircraft. Instead, Naomi remained exactly where she was. Calm, unmoved, certain. That certainty bothered Nicole more than she wanted to admit. People who were wrong usually became defensive. People who were caught in a mistake usually rushed to explain themselves. Naomi didn't either. She simply sat in seat 2A as if she belonged there, because she did. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the oval windows, casting long golden reflections across the polished armrests of first class. Outside, ground crews continued moving equipment beneath the wings. Inside, every passing second seemed to increase the pressure in the cabin. Nicole glanced once more at the boarding pass in her hand. The name was there. The seat number was there. Everything appeared valid. Yet something in her mind refused to accept what her eyes were showing her. She looked at Naomi's simple sweater, her inexpensive sneakers, her lack of designer luggage, and decided those details mattered more than the document she was holding. Across the aisle, the businessman who had been watching lowered his newspaper completely. A woman seated near the front galley exchanged a glance with her husband. More people were paying attention now. What had started as an awkward disagreement was slowly becoming the center of attention for the entire cabin. Nicole handed the boarding pass back. You still have not explained why you are sitting here. Naomi accepted the ticket and placed it neatly beside her. I purchased the seat. A few passengers nodded quietly. The answer sounded reasonable enough. Nicole frowned. That is not what I asked. Naomi tilted her head slightly. It is the answer. The words were polite, but they landed with surprising weight. Somewhere near row 4, a passenger chuckled nervously. Another looked toward the cockpit door. The aircraft should have been moving by now, yet the cabin door remained open. The jet bridge was still connected. Nothing about the departure process seemed normal. Naomi noticed it too. In fact, she had noticed it from the moment she boarded. That was why she felt no urgency, no anxiety, no need to defend herself. She already knew something everyone else did not. Nicole checked her watch. The delay was becoming impossible to ignore. She pressed a button on the interphone near the galley and spoke quietly with someone out of sight. When she finished, her expression tightened even further. Naomi watched without reacting. The stillness in her posture reminded some passengers of a judge waiting for testimony to finish. Others saw something different. Confidence. Experience. The kind that could not be purchased or performed. A young flight attendant standing near the front galley glanced repeatedly between Naomi and a digital tablet she carried. Her name tag read Emily Carter. She seemed uncertain about something she had noticed, but not yet understood. Twice, she opened the passenger manifest. Twice she looked back towards seat 2A. Before she could speak, Nicole caught her staring and shook her head sharply. Emily looked away, but the concern remained on her face. Naomi noticed that too. Then the cabin speakers chimed softly overhead. Every conversation stopped. Every eye drifted toward the front of the aircraft. Whatever happened next, it was becoming clear that this flight was waiting for more than a departure clearance. The soft chime faded, but the silence that followed felt even louder. Every passenger seemed to be waiting for an announcement that never came. The aircraft remained motionless at the gate. The jet bridge was still attached. Ground crew members moved outside the windows with no apparent urgency. Inside the cabin, impatience was beginning to spread. Nicole Harris noticed it too, and that only made her more determined to regain control of the situation. She stepped back into the aisle and fixed her attention on Naomi Brooks. This delay is because of you, she said. The accusation hung in the air. Several passengers exchanged looks. It was an easy claim to make, and for some people, an easy one to believe. A gray-haired man seated 3 rows back nodded slowly. If she would just move, we could leave. Another passenger agreed. Exactly. We are all waiting. Naomi listened without interruption. Her expression never changed. She looked neither embarrassed nor angry. If anything, she appeared thoughtful. That composure frustrated Nicole even more. People were choosing sides now. The cabin had become something larger than a disagreement over a seat. It felt like a courtroom without a judge. On one side were passengers who accepted Nicole's authority without question. On the other were those beginning to wonder why the situation had gone this far. The businessman across the aisle folded his newspaper and spoke for the first time. Did anyone actually verify her reservation? Nicole answered immediately. I know what I am looking at. The man raised an eyebrow. That was not my question. A murmur traveled through the cabin. Nicole's jaw tightened. She was losing the certainty she had projected earlier. Not because of Naomi, but because more people were beginning to ask questions. Questions made assumptions uncomfortable. Near the galley, Emily Carter stared at the digital tablet in her hands again. Something on the screen continued bothering her. She scrolled through the passenger list once more. Then again, her eyes widened slightly. The information had not changed, yet it directly contradicted everything happening in front of her. Emily glanced toward Naomi. Naomi noticed, but offered no reaction. The young flight attendant looked toward Nicole, hesitated, then remained silent. Fear and doubt wrestled across her face. Nearby, a middle-aged woman leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Does she seem nervous to you?" Her husband shook his head. "No, that is the strange part." He was right. Naomi did not look like someone worried about being removed from a seat. She looked like someone waiting for a meeting to begin. The difference was subtle, but once noticed, it became impossible to ignore. Nicole pointed toward the rear cabin again. There is still a seat available in economy. Naomi folded her hands calmly. I am exactly where I need to be. The response triggered another wave of whispers. Some passengers rolled their eyes. Others became even more curious. Outside, the sun continued sinking lower over the runway. Inside, the atmosphere felt charged. Then a man in a tailored suit sitting near the bulkhead spoke loudly enough for several rows to hear. You know what this sounds like? He looked around before answering his own question. It sounds like somebody thinks the rules do not apply to them. Several passengers nodded. Nicole seemed relieved to hear support. Naomi simply turned toward the window. Her reflection stared back from the glass. Calm, patient, unmoved. Emily looked down at her tablet one final time. This time she did not look away, because what she had just discovered made one thing painfully clear. The people arguing about Naomi Brooks had no idea who they were talking to. Emily Carter felt her pulse quicken as she stared at the passenger manifest. She checked the screen once, then twice, then a third time. The information remained exactly the same. Seat 2A, Naomi Brooks. Special designation attached to the reservation. Multiple authorization flags she had never seen associated with an ordinary passenger. Emily had worked for the airline long enough to recognize that certain names carried internal notes. Executives, board members, regulatory officials, high-profile clients. This reservation carried something different, something higher. Her eyes drifted toward Naomi again. The woman sat quietly by the window while the rest of the cabin debated her existence. The contrast felt almost surreal. Emily looked back down at the tablet. She knew she should say something. She also knew speaking up against a senior flight attendant could create problems. Nicole Harris had a reputation. Most crew members learned quickly that disagreeing with her rarely ended well. Across the cabin, the conversation continued growing. The man in the tailored suit folded his arms. Rules are rules, he said. If the crew says there is a problem, there is probably a problem. A woman across the aisle shook her head. Then why has nobody actually explained what the problem is? The question lingered. Nobody answered it. Nicole stepped forward again. Her patience was wearing thin. Ma'am, I am trying to resolve this professionally. Naomi looked up. Then perhaps start by identifying the problem. The response was calm, but several passengers exchanged glances. It was becoming harder to ignore the fact that Nicole had repeated accusations without offering a clear explanation. Nicole inhaled slowly. You are refusing crew instructions. Naomi nodded once. Because the instruction is incorrect. The cabin fell quiet again. Emily swallowed hard. She knew she could not remain silent much longer. Her eyes returned to the manifest. One line near Naomi's name stood out more than anything else. It was not merely a passenger note. It was a flag connected directly to flight operations. Emily had never seen one attached to a traveler before. Not once. Near the front row, a retired school principal named Martha Reynolds leaned toward the aisle. Young lady, she said to Nicole, may I ask a question? Nicole forced a polite smile. Of course. Martha gestured toward Naomi. Has anyone actually verified her credentials with operations? Nicole's expression tightened. That will not be necessary. Several passengers noticed the answer. More importantly, they noticed what she did not say. Emily took a small step forward. Then another. Her hands tightened around the tablet. The cabin suddenly felt smaller. The air felt heavier. Outside, the sun reflected across the wing in brilliant streaks of orange and gold. Inside, a different kind of storm was gathering. Emily finally cleared her throat. Nicole. The senior flight attendant turned immediately. What? Emily hesitated. Every eye near the galley shifted toward her. I think there might be something you should see. Nicole's expression darkened. Later. Emily shook her head. I do not think it should wait. Naomi remained silent. She simply watched. The businessman with the newspaper lowered it again. Martha Reynolds leaned forward in her seat. Even the passengers who had supported Nicole seemed curious now. Emily looked down at the screen one final time before lifting her eyes. Her voice was quiet, but in the silence of the cabin it carried farther than she expected. Her name is marked on a restricted operations list. For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty flashed across Nicole Harris's face. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. A restricted operations list. Passengers looked at one another, trying to understand what that meant. Nicole Harris recovered quickly, or at least she tried to. You are new, she said sharply to Emily Carter. You probably misread it. Emily looked back at the tablet. I did not misread it. The certainty in her voice surprised even her. Nicole extended her hand. Give me the device. Emily hesitated before handing it over. Nicole scanned the screen for several seconds. Her expression remained controlled, but something had changed. The confidence that had carried her through the confrontation was beginning to crack. Naomi Brooks noticed it immediately. So did several passengers. The cabin felt different now. Less certain. More cautious. The assumptions that had seemed obvious 15 minutes earlier were no longer holding together. Nicole lowered the tablet and folded her arms. Whatever this designation means, it does not change the fact that we need to resolve this situation. Naomi turned from the window and looked directly at her. The situation was resolved when I boarded. The answer drew another wave of whispers. Martha Reynolds nodded quietly. The businessman across the aisle looked thoughtful now rather than skeptical. Even the man in the tailored suit seemed less certain than before. Outside, airport vehicles moved slowly beneath the fading sunlight. The aircraft remained at the gate. No departure announcement. No pushback. No movement. Naomi noticed every minute that passed. She also noticed something else. The feeling was familiar. Uncomfortably familiar. 21 years earlier, she had stood inside an executive lounge at a regional airport in North Carolina. She had been 21 years old, fresh out of college, carrying a scholarship award and a folder full of internship documents. She remembered the polished floors, the leather chairs, the receptionist who looked at her and immediately assumed she was in the wrong place. She remembered explaining herself twice, then 3 times. She remembered watching other travelers walk through without being questioned. Most of all, she remembered the feeling. Not anger. Exhaustion. The exhaustion of being asked to prove she belonged in spaces where others were welcomed automatically. The memory flickered through her mind and disappeared. Naomi returned her attention to the present. The cabin around her had become very quiet. Nicole took a slow breath. Ma'am, I am asking one final time. Naomi said nothing. Nicole continued. Would you please cooperate? The wording had changed. Several passengers noticed. Earlier it had been orders. Now it sounded more like a request. Naomi folded her hands. I have cooperated. Emily looked between them. The more she studied the manifest, the less sense the confrontation made. There were notes attached to Naomi's reservation that required operational review before departure. Yet nobody seemed willing to discuss them openly. It was as though the entire aircraft was dancing around a truth hidden in plain sight. Then another chime echoed softly through the cabin. Every head turned toward the cockpit. This time the cockpit door unlocked. A narrow line of light appeared along its edge. And for the first time since boarding began, someone on the flight deck was preparing to step outside. For a few seconds after Nicole made the call, nothing happened. Yet the mood inside the aircraft changed immediately. Conversations faded. Phones lowered. Even passengers who had tried to stay out of the confrontation now sensed that something unusual was unfolding. Nicole crossed her arms and stood beside the galley with the confidence of someone who believed authority alone would settle the matter. Naomi Brooks remained seated in 2 Alpha, calm and composed, as if she had already seen the ending everyone else was still trying to predict. Emily Carter looked down at the manifest again. The operational flags attached to Naomi's reservation continued to bother her. She had reviewed thousands of passenger records during her career. She had never seen anything quite like this. Several designations were restricted. Others required executive review. One carried a priority level she had only encountered during training simulations. Emily swallowed hard. Across the aisle, passengers watched the growing silence with increasing curiosity. Nicole glanced toward Naomi. I hope you understand this situation is now being escalated. Naomi nodded once. I expected that. The answer seemed to frustrate Nicole even more. Most passengers would have looked worried. Naomi looked prepared. Then she reached into her bag and removed her phone. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and completely unhurried. Nicole immediately noticed. Who are you calling? Naomi looked up. Someone who should be informed. She pressed the call button. The line connected almost instantly. Good afternoon, Ms. Brooks, a woman answered. The professionalism in her voice drew immediate attention from nearby passengers. Naomi spoke calmly. Rachel, please begin documenting everything associated with Flight 728. There was no hesitation. Already started. Naomi glanced briefly toward Nicole before continuing. I also need operations notified. A pause followed. Then Rachel's tone changed slightly. Would you like executive review activated? Emily's eyes widened. She had never heard those words used outside training material. Naomi answered without emotion. Yes. Understood. Executive review is now active. The call ended. A ripple of curiosity moved through the cabin. Nobody knew what executive review meant, but it clearly sounded important. Nicole forced a dismissive smile. Anyone can make a phone call. Naomi simply returned the phone to her lap. She offered no explanation, no defense, no attempt to impress anyone. Somehow that silence felt more powerful than an argument. 2 minutes later, Emily's tablet vibrated. She looked down and felt her stomach tighten. New notifications were appearing across the reservation. Additional review markers, internal alerts, priority acknowledgments. One message in particular made her heart skip a beat. It instructed flight operations to suspend departure clearance pending executive confirmation. Emily looked toward Naomi again. The woman remained perfectly calm. Another notification appeared. Then another. The record was expanding in real time. Whatever process Naomi had triggered, it was moving through the airline faster than anything Emily had ever witnessed. Then the cockpit door opened. A uniformed crew member stepped into the galley and approached Nicole. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds, but every passenger noticed the change in her expression. The certainty vanished. Nicole looked at the crew member. The captain wants what? The crew member lowered his voice. Immediate clarification. When he walked away, Nicole remained frozen for a moment. Emily looked back at her tablet and felt her pulse quicken. The latest message contained only 6 words. Executive review acknowledged by senior leadership. For the first time since boarding began, Emily stopped wondering whether Naomi belonged in Seat 2 Alpha. Instead, she found herself wondering who Naomi Brooks really was. The next several minutes felt unusually long. Nobody spoke much. Nobody needed to. The uncertainty itself filled the cabin. Passengers checked their watches. Others stared toward the cockpit door. Even the usual sounds of boarding seemed distant now. Then the public address system clicked on. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain said, his voice calm and professional. We appreciate your patience. We are currently reviewing a matter that must be resolved before departure. This aircraft will remain at the gate until that review is complete. A wave of confusion moved through the cabin. The businessman across from Naomi looked up immediately. Martha Reynolds exchanged a surprised glance with her seatmate. Emily Carter felt her pulse quicken. Nicole Harris stood frozen beside the galley. This was no longer a routine disagreement. Commercial flights did not stop departure because of minor misunderstandings. Something bigger was happening. Much bigger. Nicole stepped toward the cockpit door. Captain, we already explained the situation, she said to a crew member emerging from the flight deck. The passenger is refusing instructions. The crew member looked at her carefully. The captain has reviewed additional information. That was all he said before returning to the cockpit. Additional information. The phrase spread through the cabin faster than any announcement. Naomi remained perfectly still. Across the aisle, the businessman leaned forward. If she was the problem, he said quietly, why would the captain stop the entire flight? Nobody answered. Because nobody had an answer. Emily looked down at her tablet again. Another update appeared. Then another. The operational review had expanded. New authorization levels were being attached to Naomi's reservation in real time. Nicole noticed Emily staring at the screen. What now? She asked sharply. Emily hesitated. More notifications. Nicole reached for the device. The moment she saw the latest update, her expression changed. A priority marker had been attached to the reservation. Then a second one. Then a third. None of them explained who Naomi was. But all of them suggested the airline considered her important enough to trigger reviews far beyond normal passenger procedures. Brian stepped closer. What does it mean? Nicole refreshed the screen. The information remained unchanged. I do not know, she admitted. It was the first completely honest answer she had given all afternoon. Around the cabin, passengers continued waiting. Naomi sat quietly beside the window, watching the fading sunlight reflect across the wing. She offered no explanations. She did not reveal her title. She did not mention her career. She simply allowed events to unfold. The mystery surrounding Naomi seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute. Then another message appeared on Emily's tablet. Her eyes widened. This one was different. It came directly from flight operations. Executive review acknowledged. Senior leadership notified. Departure clearance pending confirmation. Emily read the message twice. Then a third time. The words felt almost impossible to process. Nicole looked over her shoulder and saw it too. For the first time since boarding began, genuine uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Senior leadership? Brian repeated. Over a seating dispute. Nobody answered, because it clearly was not about a seating dispute anymore. Outside the aircraft, ground crews paused near the jet bridge. Inside, passengers sat in complete silence. Then the cockpit door opened once more. This time Captain Daniel Mercer stepped into the cabin himself. The effect was immediate. Conversation stopped. Even the passengers who had supported Nicole earlier now watched with growing curiosity. Daniel surveyed the first-class cabin before his eyes settled briefly on Naomi Brooks. Then he turned toward Nicole. Before this aircraft leaves the gate, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, I need clarification regarding why a fully verified passenger was instructed to leave her assigned seat. Absolute silence followed. Because for the first time all afternoon, it was clear that the questions were no longer being asked about Naomi Brooks. They were being asked because of her leadership. Every piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Martha Reynolds leaned forward in her seat. What is happening? She whispered. The businessman across the aisle looked equally confused. Captain Mercer closed the folder and addressed the cabin with calm professionalism. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Flight Operations has completed its review. Every passenger listened. Daniel continued. Ms. Naomi Brooks is a principal representative of Brooks Global Holdings, the lead acquisition partner currently finalizing a strategic investment in this airline. A wave of surprise swept through first class. Several passengers exchanged stunned glances. Others looked immediately back toward Naomi. The information explained everything without sounding impossible. Naomi was not the owner of the airline. She was not a celebrity. She was not a government official. Yet she clearly occupied a position important enough to bring senior leadership directly into the situation. Emily felt relief wash over her. The reservation flags finally made sense. The restricted operational designations. The priority acknowledgments. The executive review. None of it had been random. Nicole lowered her eyes. For the first time all afternoon, she seemed unable to find words. Captain Mercer handed the folder to Naomi. The final investment authorization documents have been approved. Naomi reviewed the pages carefully. The cabin watched in complete silence. Nobody checked their phones anymore. Nobody looked out the window. Every eye remained focused on seat 2A. Naomi signed the final page and returned the folder. Captain Mercer accepted it with a respectful nod. Almost immediately, a notification appeared on his tablet. Another followed seconds later. Then another. Corporate operations. Investor relations. Executive leadership. The strategic partnership was now officially complete. Daniel glanced at the screen and smiled. Congratulations, Ms. Brooks. A few passengers began applauding. Then more joined them. The applause spread through the cabin until it became impossible to ignore. Naomi looked surprised by the reaction. She offered a polite smile, but did not encourage it. Nicole remained frozen. Finally, she stepped forward. Ms. Brooks sighed. The words disappeared before they fully formed. Naomi looked at her calmly. There was no anger in her expression. No desire to embarrass anyone. No satisfaction in being proven right. Somehow that made the moment even more uncomfortable. Nicole looked down. Several passengers did the same. Naomi spoke softly. The problem was never that you did not know who I was. Nicole slowly looked up. The cabin became completely silent once again. Naomi continued. The problem was how quickly you decided who I could not be. The words settled over the aircraft with more force than any argument. Nobody challenged them because nobody could. Outside the window, the final light of evening reflected across the wing. Inside, an entire cabin sat quietly with the realization that assumptions had shaped every moment of the afternoon. Naomi Brooks had never changed seats. She had never raised her voice. She had never revealed her position. Yet the moment people learned her title, their treatment of her changed completely. And for many passengers on board, that realization would remain far more memorable than the flight itself. The applause faded gradually, replaced by something far more powerful. Reflection. The cabin no longer felt divided. It felt thoughtful. Passengers stared out windows, looked down at their hands, or sat quietly with their own conclusions. The confrontation that had consumed the flight was over, but its meaning lingered in the air like the final note of a song. Captain Daniel Mercer checked the confirmation on his tablet and smiled. "Everything is complete, Ms. Brooks." Naomi nodded. "Thank you, Captain." Daniel returned toward the cockpit, pausing briefly before he entered. "On behalf of the airline, congratulations." A few passengers applauded once more, but this time the applause felt different. It was not for wealth. It was not for power. It was for dignity. The cockpit door closed. Moments later, the familiar sounds of departure preparation resumed. The cabin crew completed final checks. The jet bridge detached. Outside, ground vehicles cleared away from the aircraft. For the first time that evening, the flight was finally ready to leave. Nicole Harris remained near the front galley. The confidence that had defined her earlier had disappeared. She seemed smaller somehow, not because her position had changed, but because certainty had given way to understanding. After several moments, she approached Naomi's seat. Her voice was quiet enough that only nearby passengers could hear. "Ms. Brooks, I owe you an apology." Naomi looked up. Nicole continued. "I made assumptions. I should not have." The words were simple, honest, uncomfortable. Naomi studied her for a moment before nodding. "Thank you for saying that." Nicole exhaled slowly. It was not forgiveness she seemed relieved to receive. It was the opportunity to acknowledge the mistake. Across the aisle, Martha Reynolds smiled faintly. The businessman folded his newspaper for the final time. Emily Carter stood near the galley watching everything unfold. Earlier that day, she had been the youngest crew member on the aircraft. Now she understood something many people spent years learning. Sometimes doing the right thing begins with asking one difficult question. Naomi noticed Emily and motioned her over. The young flight attendant approached carefully. "Yes, Ms. Brooks." Naomi smiled. "Thank you for speaking up when it mattered." Emily looked surprised. "I was not sure if I should." Naomi nodded. "Most important decisions begin that way." Emily smiled and returned to her duties. Outside, the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate. The city lights stretched across the horizon as dusk settled over the airport. Inside the cabin, conversations slowly resumed. Passengers who had entered as strangers now shared an experience none of them would forget. Naomi looked out the window as the aircraft began moving. The runway lights shimmered against the evening sky. She thought about the airport lounge years ago. The questions, the assumptions, the countless moments when people had mistaken appearance for identity. Yet she also thought about Emily, about Martha, about the passengers who had eventually chosen curiosity over judgment. Progress rarely arrived all at once. It arrived one decision at a time. As the aircraft turned toward the runway, Naomi closed her eyes briefly and reflected on the lesson hidden inside the entire evening. Real authority was not measured by a title. Real character was revealed by how people treated someone before they knew who that person was. The engines grew stronger. The runway stretched ahead. And as the aircraft accelerated into the night sky, one truth remained behind in the hearts of everyone on board. Naomi Brooks had not raised her voice. She had raised the standard.